Hi, my name's Sean Hoville. This is part two to our video on interesting and controversial negligence cases. I'll start from the topic of asylum seekers, as I did get cut off in the first video, so we'll just take it from there. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Share screen, get up my PowerPoints again. So here we go. Okay, so really controversial negligence cases are those in relation to asylum seekers. Australia is a party. We were actually one of the first countries to become a party to the Refugee Convention, which sets out the international requirements for how we should treat refugees and asylum seekers. The United Nations and other human rights organisations have actually condemned Australia and accused Australia of being in breach of their international human rights obligations in this area. This has been a hot political topic, and we find that it is one which forms the basis of many political campaigns. It was huge in the Howard era, and you'd probably all remember the Tampa case, or the case of the children overboard. So the Navy was actually ordered to turn around boats that were approaching Australia and send them back to, I think they were coming from East Timor at the time. One of the boats sunk, and there was people drowning in the water, children and so forth. And it took years actually for photographs and things to come out, because as we know too, this is an area where the government has conducted activities which have been done in secret, and there's a huge restriction on journalists or free media in this area. It's quite a black hole legally. So after that case and under the Howard era, there was all of this legislation brought in place to tighten up, they called it, the laws in relation to people seeking asylum here, in that centres started in offshore places such as Nauru and Manus Island, Papua New Guinea. There are centres all over Australia as well. These places are set up like prisons. They're places where refugees and asylum seekers are sent for processing. So they sit in these prisons waiting to be processed for a visa. The idea is that it's to deter people from coming via the sea to Australia. The idea is that there are protocols we have in place where you can apply for a visa offshore. The argument is if someone's life is at risk, or the situation is such that they cannot stay in their country of origin, then of course they're going to travel via the sea. They're just going to get out of there, aren't they? And that's how they end up on our shores. There's been so much controversy about this stuff. You can read widely from all the different angles. One of the things that has always stuck out in my mind is that we're actually dealing with a relatively small percentage of people. When it comes to this issue, it's not that many. I looked at some of the statistics about who had arrived and were being processed in these centres over the times, how many boat people as such were arriving in Australia, and it's not even much. You know, like a few thousand here, a few thousand there, um, compared to the rest of the world. The actual issue is uh, is is probably thrown out of proportion. Anyway, so out of all of this controversy, has there has been a lot of litigation. One of the cases is the Baby Feruz case um, in 2015, which was heavily in the media. You can go back and Google and have a look at some of the media articles and so forth. But a mother who was pregnant arrived in detention in Darwin, needed to give birth but was having complications. It was really difficult to get her to hospital in Brisbane, I think, for specialist medical care. The baby was born, the baby needed specialist Medicare, the mother needed watching, but the government wanted to send them both back into detention, and then when they were back in detention, also weren't giving them like a temporary protection visa in Australia. So a journalist got hold of this one situation, and then that exposed that there were a number of babies in detention in Darwin, a number of babies and children, and it was actually a pretty horrific situation in terms of their human rights and how they were being treated. And there was all of this argument about whether we as a government have a duty of care to at least give these people a temporary protection visa so that they don't have to live in a prison institution while they're being processed. So if we go back to our elements of negligence, we can look at duty of care. So in the litigation, what has come up? Duty of care, the safety and interactions between the government on arrival of these people. So, for example, people drowning because boats are being turned back. Well, do we have a duty of care to not allow asylum seekers or refugees to drown? Well, probably, because we've signed the United Nations Convention. Whilst in detention, what's the duty of care? Most likely fair processing times and special care for vulnerable groups, so women and children in particular. There's even this question about whether we should be imprisoning these people, so setting up prisons to deal with these people. What's the breach? Well, there's these cases that I've just talked about in Nauru and Manus Island. These are centres which have actually, I think they've largely been shut down now, but now there's just a whole bunch of people that are in a legal black hole that never got processed to live here. So now they're just living in limbo still between countries without a home. But the breach of the duty of care would be these extraordinarily long processing times or just not being processed at all. Causation, another controversial issue if you're looking in terms of negligence. How has the government caused the damage or the injury? Most of these people have horrific pre-existing trauma. There's usually horrific reasons for why they're seeking asylum in Australia. So more likely than not, even if you can argue duty of care and breach, you're going to fall down on causation. Damage, economic loss, we know that's the biggest factor in today's society where damages are capped. It seems to be the one area of damage that we value the most, economic loss. So usually there's probably not any damage either. There might be psychological or psychiatric damage, but again, most of these people have had pre-existing and horrific trauma. So the damage isn't going to equate to a high sum of money to make a claim worthwhile. So usually this, in the litigation you find that lawyers are using negligence or arguing negligence to use that as a platform for then arguing their claim under immigration laws or other laws, criminal laws, for example. So you still use this negligence argument, you still make these claims, but then you use that gives you the leeway or the platform to then expand that and look at getting them an appropriate visa. For example, when it comes to these offshore processing centres, well, who do you sue in terms of negligence? Because what the government has done is pretty much the same thing as what the US did with Guantanamo Bay. So we all know about Guantanamo Bay. It's a little island off the US where they send what they think is their high-profile political prisoners or political criminals, I guess. And it's a black hole in terms of the law. They call it the lawless prison. So it doesn't come under US domestic laws and so forth. Australia has taken that model and they've done that same thing in terms of these offshore processing centres. So what we're seeing here is a black hole in terms of the law. And the way they've done that is they've actually just paid those governments to set up these centres. So they just give them money under a contract. So it becomes a contractual relationship, and there's all sorts of non-indemnity clauses about how these people should be treated and so forth. So the litigation now, you're finding that some of these refugees or prisoners, probably call them prisoners because they're stuck essentially in an institution that they can't get out of, they're now trying to sue those governments that are administering those prisons. And Australia is basically walking away. They're getting off scot-free from that. So there might be an argument there about, well, do we perhaps have a non-delegable duty of care because we're paying these countries? But legally, if you're looking at the law, the black letter law, yes, we have created this black hole where effectively we're now immune from things that happen in those places. Australia has been heavily condemned by the United Nations and Amnesty International in particular, many other human rights organisations for this activity. The scary and the sad thing is that other countries have taken Australia's model and they are now doing the same thing. So we have set a precedent for creating black holes rife with negligent treatment that other countries are now taking on board. So there's a couple of things there that you can look at. In particular, there's one about an official government report on the actual costs of operating these offshore facilities. It has become a nightmare, and the government has been backtracking and trying to close down these facilities and so forth. So it's still a controversial topic. There's still going to be litigation that arises out of it, and it's still a political nightmare. I found a good video. Here's an article about baby Firouz. So here they had a bit of a win. They could apply for short-term visas. It'd be interesting though to see what actually happened to their short-term visas and whether they whether some of them were processed and allowed to live here now. I found this good video. The human cost of Australia's offshore detention centres. You know, this was quite recent too, April 2018. Because of all of these bans on people being allowed into these places, it's really difficult to get information about what's actually happening. So this is a guy that's actually inside the centre, and he was a journalist from Iran. So he's created a video here that we can watch, which gives us a little bit of an insight.
The main part of this systematic torture is torturing people through time. It is the main part because we don't know how many days, how many months, and how many years we have to live in limbo, in this indefinite prison. So when you put people in a situation like this, you know, you are torturing them deeply.
In 2012, Australia closed its borders for boat refugees and started sending these people to camps on remote islands. Over 1,000 men ended up on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. Here, they have faced a treatment described by Amnesty International as one of calculated neglect and cruelty. Only months after Karam Sahirian arrived to Manus, he witnessed guards and locals beating his roommate to death. 2 Papuans were sentenced to 10 years in prison, but the Australian and New Zealander suspects were never brought to justice. Zahirian still blames himself for not intervening.
Never, I can't forget. Yes, I think I am so coward because that times, yeah, I scared that time.
Since the Supreme Court ruling in 2016, the refugees are allowed to leave the camp, but Zahirian is one of many who rarely go out. He left a 9 months pregnant wife when he fled Iran. He spends hours every day talking to them over phone, but over the years, longing has ground down his resilience.
Really, I am so depressed every time I'm in my bed. Sometimes just I thinking I would kill myself. Really. But just I thinking, I don't like. But one time really I tried. But I just...
Australia's goal is to deter others from making the journey overseas. It has seemingly been a success, since no one has arrived since 2014. An increasing number of European politicians are now proposing similar measures. However, critics say that Australia's island detention has halted international progress on migration and human rights. Shabir Hussain cooks food from his home in Pakistan to keep spirits up. He says he wouldn't mind being locked up as long as he was treated with dignity. Instead, some Australian politicians and members of the Australian media have demonized the refugees. The current Minister of Home Affairs has raised suspicions that they might be terrorists. For Hussain, who fled the Taliban, this is deeply hurtful.
Refugees are rapists. They are illiterate. Many guys are here. They have a lot of skills here. I was a banker. I'm losing my skills. Day by day, I was really good at a computer, but 5 years ago, I did not touch a laptop, a computer. How it looks like, I forgot the shape, We want to do something. I'm an ambitious person. I want to do something in my life. I have only one daughter, and I'm trying to get out from the situation and bring her somewhere where I can go and get my freedom.
There you go. That was an interesting video, wasn't it? Yeah, so that's a massive area of litigation. Definitely, there's a lot of litigation steeped in negligence around that. Which takes us to another area in our history, not so controversial because it's actually now well and widely accepted, the reality of our past in relation to our Indigenous people. So the Stolen Generation in particular, I've got a beautiful song here. Let's just, there's some, here we go. Archie wrote a beautiful song about this.
Like the promises they did not keep, and how they vexed us in like sheep. Said to us, come take care of him. Set us up on mission. Told us to read, to write and pray. And they took the children away, the children away. The children away. Snatch from them all this best, that this is for the best of them. Welcome and the Holy Spirit, that you got to understand. We'll give to them what you can't give. Teach them how to live. Teach them how to live blessed. Humiliated them instead. Taught them that, and taught them this. Others taught them prejudice. The children away. The children away. Breaking their minds heart, tearing us all apart. One night their own family came and didn't give a damn. My mother cried, go get their dead. She came running for me. Mother's tears falling. That checked up and stood his ground. He said, you touch my kid, and you are. And they took the stronger melody, took us away. They took us away. Snatched from our mother's breast, this is for the best, took us away. Those what to do when they say, God I saw the white man play. Then they stood us up again and gave us gifts to each birthday. Sent us off to foster home. As we grew up, we felt alone. We were acting white, yet feeling black. One sweet day, all the children came back. The children came back. The children came back. Back where the house goes strong, back where they all belong. The children came back. Said the children came back. The children came back. Back where they understand, back to where mother's land. The children came back. Back to their mother. Back to their mother. Back to their sister. Back to their brother. Back to their people. Back to their land. All the children came back. The children came back. The children came back. Yes, I came
What a beautiful song and what a beautiful musician he is. So 1910 to 1970, approximately 1 in 3 Indigenous children were removed from their families. The stolen generations were the children of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who were removed from their families by the federal and state government agencies and church missions. And this happened under acts of parliament. They were at risk and suffered physical and sexual abuse, and they were basically used as slaves, a lot of these children. Every aspect of their lives was controlled. There was a report done in 1997, the National Inquiry into the Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, bringing them home. I've got a copy of that report. It's heartbreaking, some of the stories that you read in it, some of these real stories. Get a copy of it. There's copies of it in our library. Have a read of it. It's fascinating to read this stuff and know that the 1970s was not that long ago. So we're dealing basically with people that are the same age as my parents, for example. So this isn't a history that happened a long time ago. This is a history that we're dealing with right here and now. And that's why there's a body of litigation. 1997, that report happened. It's now 2018. Not much has happened in the area, which I'll talk about in a minute. I've got this excellent book here too, called The Reality of a Dark History. So from that book, it sets out all of the different laws that came into place in relation to Indigenous people. I've just pulled out two things which I think are interesting, is the actual settlements and missions in Queensland. So that's the first picture there. And they show you when they were established. The Cherbourg Government Settlement, which is the closest one to the Sunshine Coast, was the first, one of the oldest established settlements in Queensland, starting in 1904. And there's a map there to the right which shows where these settlements and missions were placed. I've done some interesting work being a lawyer and outside of law as well. One of my first jobs, I worked in anti-discrimination and human rights, and I worked for an Indigenous lady who's a beautiful elder who I'm now good friends with, and she has sat down and told me her life story, which we've been trying to record. And she came from Cherbourg and has told me the story about growing up in Cherbourg, how horrific that was, you know, from a little girl right up until the 70s. I was privileged to do a little bit of work on this documentary called The Domo Boys. Excellent documentary. I've put the link there if you want to get it. There's probably a copy in our library as well. And that's a whole bunch of men that have come together to look at how they grew up in Cherbourg, and then they come back to Cherbourg and they look at the dormitory. And some men, they will never go back because the experience was so horrific. These men come back and they're really, really brave, and they talk about the effect that it's had on their life, and not only on their life but on being parents as well. And there's this other excellent documentary that I found and watched called Phantom Island, which talks about the tale of a man who was removed from his family and sent to a leprosarium, so a mission that was set up particularly for people that had leprosy. Oh my goodness, that is such a moving documentary. So if you're interested, you should have a look at this stuff. It's really just incredible that this forms our history, and you know, we've been living side by side next door to Cherbourg, for example, but who has actually been to Cherbourg? Who even knows about Cherbourg? It's just crazy and fascinating and interesting. So interesting negligence cases. here's a photo that I could find. I mean, there's so many more on the internet. You should Google them. But look at Cherbourg. You know, these people were removed from mainstream society and placed into this, a paddock with houses all in a line, and then completely segregated from mainstream society, and then subjected to the rule of people, different cultures, different values, everything. And it was done, the first act was the Queensland Aboriginal Act, Aboriginals Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. Interesting fact, that act was actually used as the basis for South African apartheid. So this question has come up a bit in Australia, did we have apartheid? And well, actually, yes, we pretty much did, and this was it. So I found a bit of a an article. I mean, it's not from a very trusted source, Creative Spirits, but that's okay, because there's a lot that you can find anyway. So characteristics of apartheid: racial segregation, less rights, regulation, suppression, violence and destruction. And it just talks here about the origins of apartheid in Australia. Removing people, segregating them and placing, so not just apartheid in society, we went one step further than that. We actually removed these people from society. We removed the children in order to protect them, and we disconnected them, we fractured them from their actual grounding, their culture, their families, their attachments, all of it. So really what we did is the absolute extreme version of apartheid. And that's what we're dealing with today in terms of the litigation that's coming out or coming about from that. There's a good article here explaining the lack of widespread successful litigations by members of the stolen generations. Why? Claims in negligence are not foreclosed. So anybody can bring a claim in negligence about being part of the stolen generation. The courts haven't gone that far to say, no, you can't bring a claim. The issue is that because this activity was legalized, it was done under actual laws, the courts are reluctant to find that there is a duty of care because they consider this a novel situation. Interesting, isn't it? If you went outside of our domestic laws, our little bubble, and went to international laws and looked at the conventions on slavery and all sorts of those things, you might look at crimes against humanity, those sorts of things. You probably could argue that there was a duty of care for the country to not have those laws in place, and therefore there should be a duty of care on that basis. But again, there's these issues of policy. How far will our legal system go in order to adjust to really bad stuff that has happened in the past, in order to address that? Under the Kevin Rudd government, I can't remember what year it was. I think it was year 2011. An apology was made, and there was a huge amount of political hoo-ha about, okay, this is going to open the floodgates of litigation, rah-de-rah-de-rah. It didn't, but then under Bill Shorten was a big advocate in the Labor Party, arguing that we should create a compensation fund so that people should be compensated accordingly, because now we are aware of the issues, the negligence, the actual negligence of the governments at the time in the treatment towards these people. The next argument that I would propose, and maybe next something that came up in this documentary, is that it's not just the stolen generations that have suffered the injury or the damage. It's actually the generations after. Why? Because often children of these people are suffering as a result of the psychiatric harm that was caused to their parents or the generations before them, because these people were so brutalized that they have had issues in being able to love, for example. What were the examples of love that they were given? They were taken from their parents and they were raised in institutions. So that's more litigation that might come about. I guess this area is controversial. I'm actually going to go one step further and say it is a tragedy, because the lack of redress, the lack of success with the litigation is perpetuating, or it comes about because of the inequality between our Indigenous people and the rest of Australia. So it comes back to that issue again, and it's something that comes up. We frequently have this issue come up. So in terms of negligence, I think the elements and the structure and the way in which negligence is framed perpetuates that problem of inequality, because Indigenous people, they don't have access to the law. They usually aren't educated or have an awareness of our legal system. There's inadequate resources to deal with this stuff. And then if you break it down into the elements of negligence, again, how are you going to prove causation, for example, and damage? You know, these people have been so traumatized and have had such a horrific life under these regimes, but how are you going to specifically link the damage or the lack of economic loss, that sort of thing, to that issue? You know, causally, there's just too many factors when you're looking at the current tests that we have under negligence. So I think it's interesting, and it's an area that is controversial, and there are some politicians that are trying to advocate for a different system, such as, you know, a compensation fund, although there'll be issues with that too, but a different system that can actually address this issue adequately. Moving on to environmental negligence. Oh, this is a big one all around the world. There's so many examples. I mean, just Googling environmental disasters, environmental negligence, and you can just see so many things. So I want to show you this one video that I found, because it does talk about negligence a little bit, although a lot of the times it's framed in terms of corporate governance issues. But what we actually see in most of these cases, and especially in the class actions and so forth, is corporate negligence. So negligence on the part
The Nigerian government figures show that there have been...
I'll just explain this little bit. So this is part 2 of a YouTube. You know, this is just someone in their backyard, an amateur that's done this. But I think it's pretty good. And he's talking about a whole lot of oil spills that have occurred in Africa that nobody even knows about, and the companies that are in Africa that are being negligent. And then we move into another environmental disaster, which we can have a look at.
The 9,000 oil spills between 1970 and 2000. And there are currently 2,000 official spill sites. This is larger than even the current BP spill. Obviously, this never made headlines. One wonders then whether it's wrong to assume that the lives of Africans are of little or no value the global corporate media. They do not provide the advertisements. Big corporations do. BP today can probably find a lot of comfort in two recent judgments by the US Supreme Court on the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989. Till then, the biggest recorded oil spill in history. A jury in 1994 imposed penalties of $5 billion on the company. In 2006, an appeals court halved the punitive claims of $2.5 billion. And in June 2008, the Supreme Court reduced that amount by 80% to roughly $500 million, an average of $15,000 per plaintiff. Exxon CEO Lee Raymond, who fiercely fought the damages, retired with $400 million package, all for himself, while the Exxon Valdez victims ended up with roughly the same amount, only it was shared among 33,000 of them. That is about 10% of the original award and less than $15,000 per victim.
That's what's very depressing, to live in what's supposed to be this wonderful democracy and find out that they've purposely infiltrated the court with pro-business people and they don't give a damn about justice.
It almost makes us feel like the politicians think we're lying to them about our businesses, about the sounds held, the hearing. So it's a pretty tough deal. We have no trust for corporations and law.
But then, there are corporate crimes, and there are corporate crimes. The Enron scandal, exposed in October 2001, which eventually led to the bankruptcy of the Enron Corporation, shows that scruples are as alien to big corporations as penguins are to deserts. From late 1997 until its collapse, the primary motivation for Enron's accounting and financial transactions seemed to have been to keep reported income and reported cash flow up, asset values inflated, and liabilities off the book. Vijay Prashad, author of The Enron Blowout, calls the current phase of capitalism the Enron stage of capitalism. Fancy bookkeeping keeps the stock market happy. The owners win the cash by selling their shares. When the stock bubbles collapse, pension funds and other small investors take a hit, while Kenyans walk away with the loot.
I believe the only venue for me is the Ride of Broken Dreams.
Oh, you mean the Enron ride? Let's go. We're all gonna be rich! Even.
Dabhol plant is another such example. The cost of the plant was humongous, and so was the electricity cost for the plant. Maharashtra State Electricity Board became bankrupt once Enron started supplying power. As Enron's vice president explained, one of the reasons for the high cost of electricity was due to the high cost of education that Enron had to impart to politicians and bureaucrats in India. The courts refused to act on the Enron case. The Supreme Court dismissing CITU and Abhay Mehta's petition. India finally paid Enron and GE consortium $1 billion to get out of the contract, and also underwrite the revived Dabhol plant by another $2 billion. While Enron GE walked away from the Dabhol plant with $1 billion, Indian taxpayers took a hit to the tune of $3 trillion. But India had already experienced a corporate disaster of a much greater magnitude. The horrific Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984, when tons of the deadly methyl isocyanate gas and other toxins leaked from a Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, which killed over 22,000 people. Over 500,000 victims were maimed, disabled, or otherwise affected. Compensation paid was a meager ₹12,414 per victim, on average, on the 1989 value of the rupee, under a judgment brokered by the government and underwritten by the Supreme Court. After a quarter-century's wait, the court verdict on criminal liability did little less than add salt to the injury of the victims. The court in Bhopal held 8 former officials of the Union Carbide India Limited guilty of criminal negligence. Warren Anderson, the then chairman of the Union Carbide Corporations of USA, and other officials have gone scot-free. The 8 officials who were accused are now out on bail. Dow Chemicals, the corporation that had bought over the UCIL, today refused to pay any further compensation. Instead, the additional compensation has to be borne by the Indian Exchequer. So also, removing the toxic material in the Bhopal plant, the Indian people will foot this bill, with Dow denying any responsibility. As B. Saina, in a recent article, pointed out, in the quarter of a century since the Bhopal gas tragedy, corporate power has only grown and grown. Bhopal's happened. Society's privilege cooperates over communities. Private profit over public interest. Curb corporate power, Indian or American. What will rip you about?
So that was quite an interesting video talking more about some environmental disasters in terms of corporate governance issues or corporate crimes. There was a little bonus bit in there about the Enron scandal. That was massive. But like I said at the start in part 1 of the lecture, that negligence often acts hand in hand with other areas of law, so criminal negligence, for example. So in the Indian Bhopal disaster, the gas leak, and I'm sorry about the footage, it's probably quite disturbing to you and you might not have been ready for that. But it was found that the company in control of that gas plant was negligent in its safety and monitoring and the way in which it conducted its business and maintained its plant, which is insane, isn't it? Because they know that if there is a catastrophe, it is going to kill thousands of people. Yet there's still that standard. They'd fallen below the standard, but they'd fallen below the standard so much that it amounts to criminal negligence. But we saw in that video too that they were sued in negligence and they basically wouldn't foot the bill for the damages. There's plenty more examples of environmental negligence which has occurred. The Montara oil spill 2009 is one of Australia's worst oil disasters. There's a big class action in relation to that. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill 2010. 2011 there was a collapsed mining dam in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. And there's some media around that and about the negligence as to why the mining dam collapsed. So, I mean, this stuff is just happening all the time. One of the big issues coming up is hydraulic fracturing. So that's a current and present controversial issue in terms of the mining industry. I'm just going to put our mate Rob back on in the background because he's got a cool song which talks a little bit about mining. Let's see.
Got the top off the hill where I used to run. You filled in the gully where black snakes used to sun.
So while he's singing in the background there,
it looked like the land and the old Milton's cottage, a place for your helipad. And I heard that your money.
We're going to have a look at what's happening with hydraulic fracturing in Australia.
I saw you coming, years and miles away. We should board that old field where I used to play.
So the Northern Territory has lifted a ban on fracking,
Hippies and farmers
talks
reached
about fracking.
cohabitation, but your yuppies came
Hydraulic
along
fracturing.
and
The fracking is a method of extracting
when
fossil
there was
fuels.
silence, so soft and serene, you seemed to find peace on your mowing machine. And Mountain View Road has no mountain view, bricks upon bricks.
So our mate Rob is talking about a property that was built
unseen
in
from
Malini
afar, but
from
the lights on
some
your driveway.
people that had made a lot of money from industrial mining. And he gets quite angry about that, which is nice for musicians. They can get angry about things and express themselves. So gas fracking, why is it dangerous? It's dangerous because it actually interferes with our water systems. Here we are in Australia. Victoria has permanently banned fracking. We've got things happening in Tasmania and Western Australia. New South Wales has applied for restrictions on fracking. South Australia is planning on a 10-year ban. Why? Why are all these states banning fracking? Because it's dangerous. It affects our water systems. It creates instability to our Earth's plate. In Queensland, we're allowing the practice still, along with the Northern Territory. So we are fracking. The federal government is pushing for more fracking. Why? I would like all moratoriums and bans across Australia lifted because more gas is good for jobs and it's good for energy security and supply. The other countries frack. Well, the US, they do a lot of fracking. There's been a big boom in gas fracking in the US. There's a lot of money in it. A lot of money. But, yeah, other countries and jurisdictions have been hesitant around fracking. Why? Because of the science. It's banned in many places, including New Zealand, Germany, France, and Spain. It's banned in lots of other countries. So here we are, Queensland and the Northern Territory, and we are allowing gas fracking. I'm not sure what you think of that, but I think that's pretty scary. Yes, so that's my view. I think it's pretty scary that we are gas fracking. In particular, have a look at this article here. Where are you? Pull it up. This article, here we go. Look at this. This is the litigation, so negligence litigation in the United States about gas fracking. Look, we've got Pennsylvania, Texas, cases. We're talking about cases. They're not just one-off cases. So this is a country that has been gas fracking for a lot of time and they're making lots of money out of it. But look at all of this litigation that's coming about. There is a body of evidence which is showing that this is causing mass damage. Colorado, Look, all over the US, all over the US. New York, West Virginia. So there's fracking litigation that's occurring everywhere. We're currently doing fracking in Queensland and the Northern Territory. So there is going to be litigation, most likely, that arises from that. And the issues in relation to that in particular is the disposal of waste. So waste products are getting into the water systems, but then there's also damage to the can't remember what they're called, tectonic plates or the actual earth plates. So if you actually create trauma to those, then you can create like earth tremors and so forth. So that's causing land damage. There's all sorts of things that are happening. So yes, we're probably going to see some environmental negligence litigation in relation to this. And in those cases in the US, the plaintiffs are actually succeeding. So you can prove the elements of negligence. There is enough there, duty of care, breach of the duty of care, causation and damage to show success in these cases. And we can probably even add to that there's so many countries, and in Australia, states and territories, which have banned fracking. So common sense would dictate that it's not so good. The outcome is probably going to be more detrimental than the gain. Floods is another one that's come up. There's been some class actions around the 2011 Queensland floods, and Morris Blackburn is actually the firm that's been involved in running that class action, and they're waiting for a decision about that. The main argument is that there was negligent operation of the Wivenhoe and Somerset dams in the lead up to and during the 2011 floods, which significantly contributed to the extent and the level of flooding downstream and created a flood that was much worse than what it should have been if the dams had been operated competently. So that's been really interesting litigation. You can follow it. You can Google that and you can follow that. You can read the transcripts and the proceedings, and I'm sure we'll hear about it in the media when a decision actually comes down. Bushfires was another one, the Black Saturday bushfires. That was actually one of the largest sums ever recovered by claimants in a class action in Australia. In the media, it talks about 340 million. Again, this was another Morris Blackburn class action. Their articles talk about 700 million. I think 700 million is probably more up to date. What was the negligence? It was found that there were aging power lines and they were not maintained. So one of these aging power lines fell over, and that's what actually caused the fire. So it was completely preventable. Well, most likely, more reasonable than not, that it was preventable. So that was the negligence there. We just touched a little bit on class actions, so I just wanted to talk about class actions in general. So a class action requires 7 or more people that have claims against the same person. The claims are in respect of or arise out of the same, similar, or related circumstances, and they give rise to at least one substantial common issue of law. So just one. You can have many other issues that you raise as well, but it's just a way of grouping people together and hearing the proceedings together. So federally, we had an act which allowed this grouping of claims together to occur in 1992, but it's taken a while for it to filter down into the states and territories. But now we do in Queensland have that. It only came through, I think, last year or the year before. It's relatively recent, and it's under the Civil Proceedings Act. So it's an amendment to the Civil Proceedings Act. It's pretty much the same elements. in terms of depending on what area of law you're looking at, but say it's negligence, you're still proving the same elements of law. It's just the way in which you bring the proceedings. So class actions legislation just gives you the process that you need to go through, like how you need to state it out and how you can group people together. But it doesn't change the law. So you might have like a consumer class action, or you might have a contract class action, or you might have a negligence class action. And so you're still arguing that area of law, you're just bringing it under this particular procedure. So some of the categories that we've seen: shareholders, consumer actions, negligence claims, big cartels, so big companies getting together secretly and price fixing things so that they make more money and knock out competitors, defective product cases. And then there's been lots of automotive product recalls, and you would have heard in the media last year and a couple of years ago, different car brands that knew that they needed to recall products, but they didn't, and then people were going on to have accidents and injuries because of these defective products in the cars, such as airbags, for example. So people have died because the airbags were faulty, and the companies knew about this, the car companies, and they should have recalled the products, but they didn't. So that is negligent. So there's some negligence there. So that's all of the interesting and controversial cases that I'm going to talk about. There's a whole world out there. There's so many more. But as you know me, I love for us to come back to self-reflect on what we learn. So after I put this presentation together, I thought maybe I should do some self-reflection, seeing as I'm harping on about it all the time. And I went, holy moly, like, look at this, tobacco. I have actually had a lifetime of heavy passive smoking. From birth until 18, I was just surrounded in smoke. My grandmother had a stillborn baby. She was never the same again. That's affected the psychological environment in which my father was raised, and I guess in which I was raised as well. She was encouraged to smoke during pregnancy for all of the reasons why doctors encourage women to smoke, to keep them calm. It's good for your health. It keeps you don't put on much weight during pregnancy, and so forth. So 100% she was affected by smoking, and technically she would have had a negligence claim because she did suffer psychological damage for the rest of her life and was heavily medicated. But of course, nobody was really aware of that at the time. And it would be difficult to prove that causation element, because who's going to say that the baby was stillborn because of, because of smoking? But there is science to show that the placenta it will not be oxygenated properly if the mother is smoking, and the risks of stillbirth or premature birth are ridiculous. Like they're ridiculously high, like over 70% or something like that. So she would have had a massive negligence claim. My grandfather, he died of lung cancer. I mean, all of us probably know somebody that's been affected by tobacco, right? Asbestos. So I've had passive smoking. I've also had exposures to very high levels of asbestos fibers. My father was a builder. We lived in renovated houses. So every house we lived in was getting renovated. I actually have disturbing memories of playing in asbestos. So big piles of building materials, which were asbestos, and being covered in white dust. So this was 80s. Yes, my parents probably should have known about it. It wasn't widely known around those times, and even if it was that sort of attitude like, oh yeah, it's nothing really, it's just this big blow up in the media. So exposure to high levels of asbestos. Fingers crossed I don't get asbestosis or mesothelioma. I'm sure like 50% of us are probably doing that, going, fingers crossed we don't get this. Obesity. I've spent half a decade as a lawyer in that group action, looking at that extremely dangerous and fatal obesity surgery. So there are claims which are arising because of this problem that we have, this current problem in society of obesity. Sugar! Wow, I love sugar. I'm doomed. Basically, I'm doomed. Anytime I read something about sugar, I just think, oh my goodness. Even if we put a tax on it, I don't think it's going to save me. I feel depressed looking at it, and give me some chocolate. Sugar, it's everywhere. It's permeating all of our food in society. We're all going to be affected by sugar, this sugar problem. Asylum seekers. I am actually best friends with some remarkable and amazing people that have sought or are seeking asylum in this country. As a mother of children, that baby Farou's case just struck my core. You know, imagine being in that situation with children. Just imagine, it's part of our society. You know, we can't escape these controversial issues and these controversial cases. Environmental disasters, well, your environment is my environment. We're all linked together, aren't we? The stolen generations. I was a lawyer for that Indigenous elder, and now I'm a good friend of hers. I've spent time in Cherbourg. I helped make that documentary. Whether we realize it or not, we are all affected by the trauma that our ancestors in this country have had to live through. It lives in our land. It lives in the fabric of our society. It is the fabric of society. It is what has held us. And therefore, there's collective trauma, and it is going to live in us, whether we're aware of it or not. So subconsciously, we're going to have that in us. And what we're going to see now is that we're going to see the results of that. And, you know, every now and then it'll pop up in terms of some controversial negligence litigation, for example. So, yeah, that's a big one. And class actions, well, who doesn't know someone who's been affected in some way? I mean, I could give you 10 people that have either been part of a class action or are joining up to be part of a class action. So that's intense, isn't it? And self-reflecting on these issues. And I'd love you guys to do it as well, and we can talk about it. So do we need to change? Oh, I've put some things here. I can't imagine a life or society that has in no way been affected by the subtle or blatant negligence of others. Each negligent action has had an effect in me, in how I perceive and relate to the world, whether that's something positive or negative, a negative or positive feeling that I find in myself. What do you think it would take to be proactively virtuous? I guess if we're going to look at sort of ethical issues, or this idea of being virtuous or having a duty, because negligence talks about having a duty towards others, instead of relying on reactive compensatory measures, which, as we've talked about a lot, are often inadequate, aren't they, for those who have suffered? Is it enough for us to look back and just use hindsight to see where damage or large-scale human suffering has occurred, and just use those examples of the past to then try and rectify something in the future? Wouldn't it be easier if we actually put a clear magnifying glass to the future, and us individually, chose bold ways to act responsibly and promote the well-being of others? Does negligence require us to do that? The elements of negligence? I think it does. If we look at our duty of care, what would a reasonable person do in this situation? Whatever situation you find yourself in, I feel like if you read all of the cases and we talk about these issues, that yes, there is an element where we have to look to the future. We have to look to the future and mitigate the risk. So we should be doing this. And the negligence is occurring where that is not happening. We're not looking towards the future to mitigate the risk. As lawyers, we haven't talked about any interesting or controversial negligence cases surrounding lawyers. There are so many. As lawyers, we have a high duty of care. So in every profession, there is a capacity and opportunity to be negligent, whether it be something you've done for your own personal gain to the detriment of another, or just through lack of reflection and awareness. But in law, the onus is more heavily on us to recognize, review, and regulate our behavior and act with a sense of virtuosity, responsibility in all that we do. Why? We are the inventors, we're the expert gatekeepers, and we actually hold the keys to this complex application of this body of knowledge in our society. So as lawyers, not to put us on a pedestal, but often we are, we stand a bit higher, knowing what we know and being granted that ticket, that privilege of being in this vocation. So we have to be aware of how not to be negligent. And look, I'm going to shift this even further and say, as human beings, I think we have this responsibility just as human beings as well. So how do we act responsibly? My view, I think we need to do self-reflection. I think we need to steep that in ethical observation about how and why we make the decisions that we make. We should have a well thought out framework in which we act and think, and we need to have that in place so that we can mitigate the risks of falling below a reasonable standard of practice. So how can we do that? There's this great website, the Markula Center for Applied Ethics. They've looked at ethical frameworks. There's an app for it. So you can download the app, you can read through the guide, and it will help you to create that framework to mitigate the risks of being negligent in the things that we do. And sometimes we're just burnt out and we're lacking inspiration. And there's a great song by our mate Rob who looks at change. So I'll play that for you now.
We change socks and we change our lovers. We change clothes and we short change one another. We change rules, we change lanes. We'll be kicking buckets if we don't change. We gotta change our pants so they get crusty. Change our locks so they get rusty. Change our money back to beans, cause money means nothing on the high seas. Mama Earth getting hot and it's all full. When the oceans rise, we'll be eating soul. Yes, strong readers gotta turn the page. We gotta change our minds. Yeah, we got to change. We gotta change our sheets so they got stains. Change our minds like we got brains. Change our money back to gold, cause money means nothing on the sinking boat. Mama Earth getting hot and it's all full. When the oceans rise, we'll be eating soul. Yeah, soul readers gotta turn the page. We gotta change our minds. Yes, we got to change. See, we gotta change our shoes. They carry shit. Mama Earth will work them, but she gonna quit. Change our money back to stones, cause the money means nothing on the back of bones. We gotta stop making papers and to make some sense. When the shit go down, we just sit on the fence. Yeah, soul learners gotta turn the page. We gotta change our minds. Yeah, we got to change. Don't you know it's getting hot in the city? Hot in the city tonight. Don't you know we gotta change.
So that was a bit of fun. And I would just like to thank my friend Rob Longstaff for allowing me to use his music. So let's see if I can get back. Thanks for listening to me, and I'm going to post, I'm going to open a forum on the Blackboard site for comments and just general commentary on the lecture about interesting and controversial cases, because I would love to hear your views. I do apologise for some of the sensitive footage that I've shown. I can imagine you've probably been triggered in a few ways if you weren't aware of some of these controversial negligence cases and some of these things that have been happening around the world. But thank you very much, and enjoy your future studies.